Well, hello there, Scrublords, and welcome to another episode of Scrub Chats, where I find a topic and talk about random stuff for a little while. Today we got a couple of topics to cover. The most pressing topic is going to be the, recent news about the confirmation of Japanese ground forces coming to War Thunder. Now, a lot of people were skeptical about the Japanese ground forces because, let's face it, the Japanese weren't exactly well known for their tanks during the Second World War. So, this isn't going to be as much of a devlog chats episode, but I am going to give some of my own personal thoughts on the tech tree, and then we're going to go over a tech tree that somebody has actually posted up on the forums. I'll put a link to where I found that in the video description, so you guys can go check that out as well. And I'll have that up on screen, and we'll zoom in and take a look at certain vehicles and certain aspects of the Japanese tech tree and try to figure out what the Japanese are going to be all about in terms of the meta. So without further ado, let's get on with it. So the very first vehicle that we're going to be taking a look at here, and the one of only two that they've released photos of, and our very, very first look of the Japanese, is the Type 95 Ha-Go light tank. Now, the Japanese, as many people realize, were not exactly well known for their tanks during the Second World War. Now, a lot of their thought processes was along the lines of what most other nations thought tanks were before the war and during a lot of the Japanese fighting in China. One of the major lessons the Japanese realized was that tanks are useful and tanks are excellent infantry support weapons. And they took their lessons and they took a look at what was going on during the First World War, and they saw how the Western Allies, because the Japanese fought with the Allied powers in the First World War, they took a look at the Western tank designs, and they figured, okay, well, let's develop some lighter infantry support tanks. And one of the vehicles they were very, very influenced by and saw great potential in was the Renault FT-17. And the Renault FT-17 is well known as one of the very, very first and modern tank designs. Engine in the back, crew in the front, fully rotating turret, that sort of design. And so the Japanese took a look at that and they went, okay, let's develop some lighter vehicles to help support the infantry. Now, a lot of the fighting the Japanese were doing in the mid-30s leading up to World War II was in China. They were fighting the Chinese, and the Chinese didn't have any tanks. So the Japanese standards for tank design were set for fighting countries that didn't have any armor of their own, especially in China because, like I said, the Chinese didn't have any tanks. They didn't have any infrastructure to build tanks. The Chinese were in the midst of a civil war between the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese communists under Mao Zedong. So the country was divided, first of all, and on top of that, you had all these other warlords fighting for control of the country. It was a pretty big war zone, and now that the Japanese have moved in and started taking over territory, their resources were further divided because not only were they fighting each other in some cases, but now they actually had to fight a modernized military with aircraft, tanks, loads of infantry, heavy machine guns. I mean, the Chinese were not in a particularly great state of affairs in terms of ground warfare against the Japanese. Now, going back to what I was saying earlier about the Japanese tanks really didn't need to be all that great. All they needed to be was small, light, easily transportable by rail, and had enough armor on them to stop rifle fire and light machine gun fire. They didn't really need to worry about heavy-duty 50 caliber machine gun fire or anti-tank guns or something like that. The Chinese didn't have any of that. So simply having a tank that had a couple of machine guns sticking out of it and a small bore cannon that they could fire maybe canister out of was considered to be more than adequate, and that's what the Japanese went with. Now, a lot of people ask the question, why didn't the Japanese build any heavy tanks during the war like the Germans did? Well, for most of the terrain that the Japanese were fighting over, heavy tanks were not suitable. Heavy tanks would have been totally impractical, and the Germans found this out during the war, that the bigger these tanks got, the more and more expensive and impractical they were to use on the battlefield. Sure, like if you get them into a very, very narrow position where the enemy has to come to the vehicle to attack it, and it's got a very long gun, and it's got lots of armor, it's fantastic in a defensive position. Going over to the attack, though, yeah, it can potentially be like a breakthrough tank, But at the same time, getting that vehicle to that location is, one, very, very difficult, because not only were the Germans having to put up with issues with different rail gauges, and some of the tracks on the tanks were too wide, so they'd have to put on traveling tracks and stuff like that. And the Japanese heavy tanks, like we're probably going to see in the game, these things are mouse-level size. I mean, they are 100 to 150 ton tanks, especially in the case of the OI, which we might very well see in the game. I mean, I would be very, very surprised if we didn't see the OI initially. These things are as large as a mouse, and could you imagine the Japanese trying to move these things around on anything but their own power? And even if they were running under their own power, they would take up so many resources to run. I mean, simply just moving them places is an operation in and of itself. And during the Second World War, a lot of tanks were not exactly designed to move over massive, vast distances under their own power like tanks are today. Tanks these days are better equipped to cover very, very long distances under their own power. Now, granted, they still need to be refueled and they still need to have logistic supplies, but in World War II, it was better on the tanks and better on the wear of the vehicles. It costed less maintenance to simply put them on a train and then get them to the assembly areas where they would demount the vehicles and set them up for an offensive. Now, could you imagine trying to do that when you've got hundreds of small islands in the South Pacific and you've got troops on all of them, and trying to spread out and concentrate enough armor on each of those to counter an American attack where you have no idea where it's going to come? Yeah, it's not happening. Especially if you've got vehicles like the OI, which weigh 150 tons, when most cranes can barely lift above 30, 40 tons. I mean, even in Europe, at the port of Antwerp, cranes there were only rated up to about 40 tons maximum. And having that sort of infrastructure on small, tiny islands in the Pacific was basically unheard of, unless it was a major military naval installation. And even then, those cranes were designed for building ships, building warships. So, generally, just getting these things off the boats and onto the boats, or the cargo ships and the transport ships, to get them to these islands would have been a massive undertaking for the Japanese. And it would have costed them so many resources that, well, it just wasn't practical. So, as a result, you don't see very many of the Japanese heavy tank designs until at least anywhere else but on the Japanese mainland, because moving them anywhere around the Japanese mainland was considered to be practically impossible. And even moving them around the mainland was almost an impossibility in and of itself. So, what I'm getting at here is that the fact that we're getting a Japanese tech tree and the fact that they may have quite a few vehicles, just don't expect a massive amount, at least in the heavy tank department, or at least in the massive anti-tank weapon department. Again, the Japanese were mostly designing their tanks to fight other lighter tanks or to fight infantry. And they did very well at fighting the Chinese, and that was mainly down to the fact that, again, the Chinese had no real anti-tank capability. I mean, really, your only option at that point is to charge the vehicle from an angle where it's not looking at you, because tanks are blind for the most part. They need infantry support to cover them. And maybe toss a grenade down the hatch if you have them. So, I mean, again, Japanese tanks, not so great at anti-tank work, mainly because they weren't exactly, the earlier versions were not designed for anti-tank work. Now, I'm not saying that the Japanese never did design vehicles that were meant for anti-tank work. The next vehicle we're going to be taking a look at here is the Chi-Ha, and the Chi-Ha came about after the disastrous Japanese fighting at Khalkhin Gol against the Russians. At Khalkhin Gol, the Russians deployed masses of BT-7s and T-26 tanks, and the Japanese were going up against these things with Ha-Gos and Type 97s, and it just wasn't going very well. The Ha-Gos were knocked out in quite decent numbers from what I've read, and the Russian tanks just sort of ran rings around them. And so what the Japanese decided was they needed a tank that had proper anti-tank guns and some decent armor, but still keep it light enough that they could easily transport it. So that's where the Chiha came in. And so the Chiha is kind of what the Chiha is what the Japanese call a medium tank. The tank is still under like 20 tons, I think. And it just goes to show the major differences between a lot of the nations and their ideas on tank warfare. I mean, Japanese medium tank 17 tons, British light tank 25 tons. I mean, you see these massive differences between the way these countries think and their different approaches to tank warfare. It's really quite interesting. So again, going back to the Chiha. So the Chiha was designed for basically taking out or going head-to-head with lighter tanks, basically cruiser-type vehicles like the BT-7. So this is where you start to see the Japanese start to realize, okay, having all these infantry about is really nice and all, but what we really need potentially is the ability to kill other tanks if we come across them, especially the Russians, because the Japanese were scared shitless of that the Russians were just going to pour across the Manchurian frontier and take over Manchukuo, which they later on did in 1945. So this fear led the Japanese to start designing slightly better tanks to fight these early Russian vehicles. Now, as World War II went on, the Japanese ended up having to put less and less emphasis on tanks simply because a lot of the fighting they were doing in the South Pacific against the Americans once they joined the war didn't... the fighting wasn't practical to move a lot of these tanks around. Now, once the Japanese got their first taste and first encounters with vehicles like the M3 Lee and the Sherman, not only in the Southeast Pacific, but in or the Southwest Pacific, but in places like Burma and India, they started to realize, okay, we need something even bigger now to combat the Sherman. And the Japanese basically spent the rest of the war developing vehicles that would counteract the Sherman. Whereas we basically spent most of the war trying to, or experimenting with certain objects and vehicles that we could use to take out even heavier tanks like the Tiger and the Panther. I think it's an interesting paradox how the Japanese had a completely different view, looking at the vehicles that they were facing, American Shermans and Stuarts and such, and they spent not a ton of resources because most of these medals were going towards aircraft and warship manufacture, but it's interesting how they spent some resources looking at different ways they could easily and more efficiently combat the Shermans on an equal basis. Now, one other interesting fact about the Pacific War in terms of tank combat was the M3 Elite, for example. It was a stopgap measure. The General Grant. They were both stopgap measures until the Sherman came along. Well, one of the things the Allies realized was since the Japanese had very, very little in the way of proper anti-tank weaponry, a lot of these M3 Lees and Grants were, after their use was done in the West and they had been replaced by Shermans, these things were all sent over to the Asian theater and to the Pacific theater, where they found that having those multiple different types of weaponry was actually quite useful, because if you've got a lot of machine guns and you're fighting in dense, thick brush, you could do a lot of damage with that many machine guns and cannon. One of the most of the ammunition that tankers carried, for example, on the 37mm on these M3 Lees was canister, which basically just turns the 37mm into a giant shotgun, and that canister is just devastating against jungles and packed together thickets. And then you had HE for the 75mm gun if you ever ran into like a pillbox or something like that. So, I mean, vehicles like the M3 Lee were actually considered to be very, very, very good vehicles in the Pacific theater simply because they had so much varying firepower that they could put down in all different directions. The M4 Sherman, even more so, there were variants of the Sherman later on that had flamethrowers fitted to them. I don't think the M3 Lee ever had flamethrowers, but again, I'm not totally sure. But the M4 Sherman had crocodile variants which had flame projectors instead of main guns and stuff like that. So you had all these different variations to fight the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. But again, I'm getting sidetracked here. This was supposed to be on Japanese tanks, and here I am talking about different versions of the American tanks. So getting back to the Japanese, the Japanese tech tree, I found an example here on the War Thunder forums, and it's a very, very nice depiction, and I feel that this is actually quite accurate. I doubt this is the actual thing. I'm pretty sure somebody made this. I wish I remembered who it was. I'll put a link in the forum post where you guys can check it out and give the guy credit. But so let's take a more in-depth look at this tech tree. Now, I'm going to be the first to admit that I don't know all that much about the Japanese tanks. The Japanese tanks are not exactly my specialty in terms of knowledge. Now, I'm sure that there are plenty of people who are more aware of these things, and most of the fact that I don't know a lot about these vehicles is down to the simple fact that most of the books out there are not in English on Japanese tanks. Most of them are in Japanese, and I don't read Japanese, I'm sorry. So, this is going to be a bit of an interesting, I guess, how would I put it? Line of discovery for all of us in terms of how the Japanese tanks are going to perform. So let's start here at the top with some of the more, let's say, well-known vehicles. So starting at the top left, we've got the Type 97 and the Type 95. That appears to be the Hago, and again, most of these early vehicles are going to be more along the lines of infantry support vehicles. So the difference between the light tanks line, the medium tanks line, and the heavy tanks line is really going to be more down to slight weight differences and maybe slightly different orientations of the weapons. Most of these vehicles don't exceed more than 15 to 20 tons at maximum, and really, compared to other nations, you could classify all of these vehicles as light tanks in Tier 1 for the most part. And especially those two heavy tanks that you see there in the first line of heavy tanks right at the start. Those in particular, most of the Japanese tanks or heavy tanks, they simply weren't practical if they were anything more than, 15, 20 tons. So what classifies as a heavy tank in the Japanese line of thinking would be considered more like an infantry support tank or an infantry tank in the British doctrine, for example. Now, as far as anti-tank weapons go and tank destroyers go for the Japanese, most of these tank destroyers are going to be more along the lines of assault guns or open-topped assault guns. In the case of the Tier 1, it's literally just a truck with a modified anti-tank gun mounted on the back of the truck, firing over the cab, much like the way the flak bus that was just introduced in 1.63 is. You're gonna see down the line that this isn't the first vehicle to do such things. And you can see there clearly in the SPA AG line the second set of Tier 1 anti-aircraft vehicles is just half tracks with anti-aircraft guns mounted on the rear. I mean, a lot of these vehicles are simply just modifications of the same chassis with different types of weapons and guns mounted on them, much like what the Germans did with their Martyr series. So we can see here in Tier 2 that the Japanese are starting to realize, okay, these infantry support type vehicles, while okay when fighting troops that are not equipped with anti-tank weapons, they're not so good against much else. So we should probably consider putting some slightly bigger guns on these things. Now, of course, we don't have any pictures of the Type 97 Heavy Kai or the Mitsu 104 or the Type 96 and Type 97 Heavies from Tier 1, so we have no idea what those look like, or at least I don't. If anybody has like some sort of pictures, feel free to post them in the video description, the chat and the comment section below. And so let's take a look here at the light tanks line. So we've got the Type 3 K-Ri, the Type 98 K-Nikai. I'm sorry, by the way, for anybody who speaks Japanese. I am terrible at Japanese, so you'll have to forgive me. I can do German all day, well, sometimes all day, but Japanese, I am very much hopeless. So you bear with me. So we've got Type 3 Kachi, Type 4 Keinu, Type 5 Toku. So it looks like the Type 2 and the Type 5 look very, very similar, and they are probably related in the same design departments or something. and they look to be more like amphibious tanks than anything else. That would be kind of interesting, the Japanese light tank line featuring some amphibious vehicles. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, so here you got all the different variants of the Chi-Ha, or at least 3 of them. These are armed with 47mm guns, and I'm pretty sure these are all just slight improvements of each other. If somebody wants to tell me the differences between them, please let me know down in the comment section. The Type 1 Chi-He comes after that. That looks to be a sort of up-armored Chi-Ha. That'll be my guess. Maybe an up-gun variant. And then we've got the Type 3 Chi-Nu and the Chi-Nu 2. Now, the Chi-Nus are, I guess you could consider them to be sort of the Japanese variant of the Panther. They had a very, very high-velocity 75mm gun and some pretty decent armor as far as Japanese standards goes, about 75mm of armor at the front. And so these things are fairly armored. They have about the same armor as a KV-1, and they've got a gun similar in a lot of ways to the Panther's Long 75. So these are going to be some seriously competitive vehicles, and these are probably going to be along the lines of, let's say, I'd probably compare them most to, in terms of the progression, to when you're playing the Germans and you finally get up to the Panzer IV F2, because the Panzer IV F2 is by far a major highlight of the German line, because that's the first tank, with the exception of the Sturmgeschütz 3F, where you get a long-barreled gun that can hit hard, it can punch well above its tier, and it does a lot of damage when it penetrates. Now, I'm not sure if the Japanese fired only solid-shot armor-piercing, or they had a mixture of solid-shot and armor-piercing with explosive filler. I guess we'll just have to wait and find out. If people have more, if people have more in-depth information on this, please leave it in the comment section below. I really want to see it, and I really want to read up on this. Or if anybody has any links to some good English books on the subject, please link me to it. So the Japanese tank destroyers. So we've got the Type 4 Hoto and the Honi 3. The Honi series is kind of like is very, very similar to the German Marder series. They basically took one of their Chi-Has or Chi-Hos and basically took the turret off and then mounted a gun platform with a gun shield and then a higher velocity gun on it. The Chi-Ha 120mm, that looks to be more along the lines of an infantry support tank, but they probably put it in the tank destroyer line because it has a very, very big gun. The Type 5 Jirosha. I apologize to anybody who's Japanese or can speak Japanese in the comments section. I'm very, very sorry. You're going to have to bear with me on this one. So the Type 5, I'm just going to call it that because it's much simpler to do, looks to be almost like it reminds me a lot of a Ferdinand, but who knows if it actually has that kind of armor. Speaking of Ferdinand-type vehicles, the Japanese did have a couple of heavy tank destroyers they called the Ho-Ri series. They might actually have them farther down here. And I like to call those things the Ho-Ri shits, because if you think of it like this. Think of a Ferdinand with about as much armor. Instead of a long 88, you've got a long high-velocity 105mm gun and a coaxial 37mm gun down in the hull for some reason, and then a coaxial machine gun. And think of it about the size of a Ferdinand. I mean, those things are just hilarious. If those of you guys who play Men of War Assault Squad or play any of the Men of War games with the Japanese in them, it will know exactly what I'm talking about. Those things are absolutely hilarious to play. Now, as for SPAA vehicles, doesn't seem to be very much there. They look like light tanks with anti-aircraft guns mounted on the tops of them without a turret. So I don't think there's anything too special there. As for premium vehicles on the far right-hand side there, you can see that there are quite a few interesting vehicles there. We've got the Type 97 Chi-Ha Kai, APPL. I'm not sure what the APPL means. Application, I'm not sure. 10 centimeter experimental, so that looks like just a specialized chassis built to test the Japanese 100mm gun. The Japanese are going to be getting a lot of 105s and 100mm guns pretty early on, it seems, so they may have some decent firepower and some tank destroyers. The OI 100-ton, that's just simply an OI with the turret removed. So, I mean, if that thing is put in at Tier 2... oh, that's going to be a real pain in the ass to deal with. Now, the OI has a main turret with a 150mm gun generally, and in World of Tanks, I think you can also fit it with a 105 or 100mm gun. And then you've got two turrets on the front of the vehicle next to each other, mounting 47mm anti-tank guns, and then you've got a turret on the back fitting two machine guns. So, I mean, the OI 100 ton, even without a turret, could be potentially a very, very, very strong vehicle in terms of just tanking damage. It may not be as good at ditching it out, but at the very least it can tank some damage and bounce some shots. So that should be interesting to see. Now, moving on to Tier 3, we've got some even more interesting vehicles and some more, relatively powerful vehicles. We're moving, now the Japanese are really getting going in terms of anti-tank work here. So, as far as light tanks go, with the M24 Chaffee, that's got to be like a captured variant, or maybe what the Japanese were given after the war was over. The Japanese, once they realized that the light tanks simply weren't all that great in terms of actually carrying the day and against enemy tanks, they quickly stopped building them. They found out that it wasn't worth developing these new light tanks when they figured they were just going to get blown up anyway, and it wasn't really going to be that much worth the effort. So the fact that the Japanese are getting an M24 Chaffee, according to this tech tree, they are getting an M24 Chaffee. By the way, none of this is not the official tech tree, by the way. It looks official, but it's not. We'll have to see when the actual tech tree release comes out. This is all just speculation, so I probably should have put a disclaimer there right before I started this, but whatever. Who gives a fuck? So so as for medium tanks, the Japanese are really starting to pick up the pace here. The Type 3 Chinu Kai, so that's just an improvement of the previous two Chinus. That one's probably got a little bit more armor on it. The Chito and the Chito production. So the Chito looks like the prototype or the pre-production vehicle, and then you've got the Chito that would have been put into production. After that, you've got the Chi-Ri. Now, I like to think of the Chi-Ri, whereas the Chito is more like a panther, or the Chinu is more like a panther. The Chi-Ri would be more or less along the lines of a tiger or a king tiger. It has 100mm of armor at the front and basically a Japanese-built copy of the 88mm gun. At least I think it's a copy. Regardless, it's an 88mm gun. And it also has a coaxial 37mm gun in the hull. Now, why the Japanese felt they needed to put a secondary gun down in the hull and store yet more ammunition inside the tank, make the tank more cramped, I have no idea. But, again, the Japanese weren't exactly well known for their tank designs. As for heavy tanks, we got one. The OI 150 ton. This is the vehicle I was referring to earlier. 150mm gun. Lots of all-around good armor. It's got, on top of its main turret, it's got two other frontal turrets and then a rear turret with mounting a machine gun. So this, by the way, is going to be the biggest and most heavy tank at Tier 3, by far. There's just nothing that comes close to this thing. This thing is going to be the size of a two-story or 2 or 3-story building. Describing it in words does not give the thing justice. So if we see this thing in game, it's going to be a big motherfucker. And it's going to create some very, very interesting gameplay. As for tank destroyers, these look like half-tracks with anti-aircraft guns mounted on the back. So, not much to see here. The Taha anti-aircraft vehicle, I'm comparing chassis right now. That looks like a Chi-Hei chassis with the Japanese 25mm multi-barreled gun mount. So basically, kind of similar to the American Bofors, 40mm anti-aircraft guns, just much smaller, and that was generally mounted on warships. So that'll be kind of interesting to see something like that. As for premiums here, we've got the Chito Chinu, which appears to be like a different turret hull combination between those vehicles. The Ho Chi, which appears to be a very, very large self-propelled gun with a very, very big gun. Of course, I have no idea what this gun is going to be, so don't ask. If you guys want to go and look up the Ho Chi, you guys can probably find something, and please, if you do find something, please leave a comment down in the description. I want to hear about it. So the Panzer VI Tiger, that's not surprising that the Japanese would potentially get a Tiger tank. They were sent plans via U-boat from the Germans. I think they purchased it for, I'm trying to remember the amount of Reichsmarks they paid for it. It's not coming to my head. But they paid the Germans in Reichsmarks for it. And so they sent over the blueprints for the Tiger, and in Japanese service that would have been known as the Heavy Tank Number 6. So that's not surprising. M4A3 Sherman, not surprising either. The fact that the Japanese don't have more captured vehicles in this premium tech tree that this guy has built is actually kind of surprising to me personally, but again, all of this is speculation. None of this is official documentation, so take all of this with a grain of salt. These are just some of the vehicles we might see, and even then, even if we do see some of these vehicles, we're not going to see all of them in here. They're gonna have to save some stuff for some coming updates. So, in any case, let's move on to Tier 4, shall we? So Tier 4, we've got another interesting selection of vehicles. Again, this is what I'm talking about when I say that the Japanese started to get some quite, let's say, they started building some pretty impractical tank designs at this point. And this is also about the time where the war ends for the Japanese, and so a lot of these vehicles, or some of these later tier vehicles, we're actually going to see as potentially post-war vehicles that the Japanese built as part of their Japanese Defense Force that they set up after the war. So, light tanks, M41 Walker Bulldog. Now that I can, even though it's an American vehicle, I can potentially see that in there, because the Japanese Defense Force might have used Walker Bulldogs. Again, I'm not sure off the top of my head. Please correct me in the description below if I am wrong. I'm doing this all in one take, or one or two takes, so I'm going off my own knowledge here. So, M40 Walker Bulldog, I could easily see that being in the Japanese regular tech tree, though if they made it a Tier 4 premium, I would be fine with that as well. Let's see here. The STA-1 as the light tanks. These are basically Japanese ST vehicle turrets mounted on M4 chassis. So you can see that they've got M4 Sherman hulls there, and then they've got specialized turrets, and these turrets are housing basically license-built American 90mm guns. So if these are the Japanese light tanks of Tier 4, then they could be especially devastating with those 90mm. They could do a lot of damage. Alright, so Chiri 2. So it doesn't look to be all that much different from the Chiri 1. And actually, no, it has a completely different turret. It looks like a much, much larger turret. So the Chiri 1 might have the 75mm gun that the others may have, and the Chiri 2 may have that long 88 that I was referring to when I was talking about the Tier 3s. The Chisei, that looks like a specialized vehicle mounting a 105mm gun or a 100mm gun, but again, I could be wrong. And then the STA-1 and the STA-2, these are very well-known vehicles for World of Tanks. Very fast mediums, hard-hitting with 90mm guns. Essentially kind of like the Japanese Pershing, just a lot less armored. And I imagine these vehicles are going to be a lot more mobile than the Pershing, because the Pershing is more or less a heavy tank in the medium tank disguise. We've got the OI 120 tons, so this is 30 tons lighter, and this appears to have ditched some of the smaller turrets, but has a completely different turret design, mounting a much bigger gun, or a much more high-velocity gun. The Chiha 120mm, I think that's fairly self-explanatory. It looks like it's a very similar system to the Archer, where it looks like a Chiha's hull that has been turned around, and then a 120mm anti-aircraft or field gun mounted on the chassis. However, I feel that a gun of that size would dramatically overstress such a light chassis. So, I mean, and if it has the same driving system as the Archer, it's going to be quite, let's say awkward to drive, especially at Tier 4. The Kato looks like another Martyr variant, and then we've got the Type 5 Ho-Ri, or as I like to call it, the Ho-Ri shit. So, like I said, you can see there, looks almost exactly like a Ferdinand. More likely it's much less armored than a Ferdinand, but regardless, it's got a 105mm gun and a coaxial 37, and it looks like a heavy machine gun or a small flat gun mounted on the top of it. Could you imagine that thing? A Ferdinand with an anti-aircraft gun mounted on the top. That would be fantastic, even if it's totally impractical. As far as anti-aircraft goes, we got the Shisei, and that looks to be just a flatbed truck with a 75mm gun field gun mounted on it, or anti-aircraft gun mounted on it. If that's going to be an SPA-AG, then we're going to have to start getting airburst rounds for larger caliber weapons. As far as premiums go, Type 5 Chiri 2 Kai. I have no idea what that vehicle is, other than it's a Chiri, and it looks to be slightly different in some respects to the regular Chi-Ri and the Chi-Ri 2. The Ho-Ri 2, you can see that looks more along the lines of a Jagdtiger. So the casemate is mounted on the middle of the hull with the engine to the rear, and the crew compartment at the front of the vehicle, much like a Jagdtiger. So you can see how the Japanese were probably looking at the German tank developments as World War II went on. So with that basically covers Tier 4 and the end of World War II and the start of the post-war era. So let's see what the Japanese can bring to the table after the war. So, like we said before, we're going to start with the... Oh, wait a second. There's no light tanks. Alrighty, so we're going to start with the medium tanks. So we've got the STA-3 and STA-4, which I imagine are just variations of the STAs that we've seen before in Tier 4. I'm not sure what the difference is between those and the previous versions, so I'll have to go and look up the differences between them. The Type 61 appears to be the production version, so the STAs may be prototypes, I guess, and then the Type 61 would be the production variant of these vehicles. Again, looks like it's mounting a 90mm gun. It looks like it's got a turret-mounted machine gun and a slightly more modernized hull design. So, again, we'll have to see how these vehicles perform. If anything, they'll probably end up being like basically a group of M46 Pattons, sort of. So once we get them in game, maybe we'll be able to see the difference between them if we get all of these variants. Again, like I said, I keep reiterating that I should keep reiterating this. This is not the official tank tech tree release. This is a community post on the forum site. So if we were to get a lot of these vehicles, don't be surprised. However, if we do not get a lot of these vehicles, don't be surprised either. So, moving on here, again, so we got the STB1, STB2, and STB3, and these are all prototypes for the Type 74 Japanese medium tank, which served the Japanese Defense Force up until I think the early 90s, where they got their more modern main battle tanks, or the late 80s actually, I believe, for the Type 74. And so the Type 74 is basically going to be kind of like a Japanese Leopard. Very, very little armor, highly mobile, highly deadly with an L7 105mm gun. So it's going to be able to fire NATO ammunition, or in this case, it would be called SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, whereas NATO is I think it's North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or nearly said North American. I don't know what I'm talking about. So they would have been able to fire standard NATO ammunition, from that L7 105mm gun. It's the same gun that you get on the Centurion Mark 10, the Leopards, and the M60s. So if you're familiar with that gun, then you're going to like these late war and post-war Japanese medium tanks. As far as heavy tanks go, we've got one, and this is the Type 4/5 Heavy. Now in World of Tanks, they've got a Type 4 Heavy and a Type 5 Heavy, and really the only differences between them are soft stats and slight improvements in armor. The Type 4/5 Heavy is a monster of a vehicle. I mean, this thing weighs close to a mouse. I think it's like 160, 170 tons. And this vehicle mounts a 140mm gun with a coaxial 37mm gun mounted in the hull. The armor on it is anywhere between 240 to 250mm thick, and it is a monster. I mean, this thing is huge. So, again, a lot of these Japanese heavy tanks are not exactly going to be practical, but they're going to be absolutely massive, and they are going to be a very dominating presence on the battlefield if we see them in War Thunder. Again, the Type 4/5 was just a paper design. It was never actually built. So, and I know that Gaijin has a sort of, let's say affinity with not... They don't like introducing paper tanks if they don't have to, but they may introduce the Type 4/5 Heavy as a sort of endgame heavy tank like the Germans have the Maus. So we'll have to see. The Type 60s, I have no idea of anything about. They appear to be post-war self-propelled guns, and then we've got the Type 74 howitzer. So that basically covers the most of Tier 5 there. Now, there isn't any Japanese ATGM vehicles in this tech tree, but we'll have to see what the Japanese get in terms of end-tier ATGM vehicles, because not having an ATGM vehicle right now is kind of a downer, really, and it puts your side at a potentially significant disadvantage. So in any case, we've got the Type 60s and the Type 74 howitzer for the tank destroyers, and then finally we got the Type 61 SPG. So it looks like or an SPAAG. So it looks basically like a Japanese Gepard. So I think that basically covers it. If you guys have any questions about these vehicles, or you have any further information on these vehicles you'd like to let me know about, please put them down in the comment section below. This video has run on for a grand total of over 40 minutes now, and I should probably start to edit this and render it and get it uploaded here before I've got to take care of some things for War Thunder. So with that, keep your tracks checked, keep your binos in place, and keep around on the tube, and I will see you guys in the next video.